The air, thick with the sharp scent of pine and raw, wounded earth, was cold for a crisp autumn morning. My brother Gary stood at the edge of the detestation, a wasteland of stumps where a 50-acre stand of old-growth hardwood had stood just days before. He grinned, slapping a muddy hand on the shoulder of the logging foreman. "See, Forrest? This is progress. $400,000 worth of progress." He gestured to the ruin with a proud sweep of his arm, as if he'd built a cathedral instead of a graveyard. The foreman chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. He's still looking at it like he lost a pen. Gary's laughter was louder, sharper. He thinks trees are family, always been soft. He turned to me, his eyes glinting with the triumphant cruelty that twisted my gut. "It's done, old man. You can't stop it now. This is a done deal." The finality in his voice was a hammer blow, meant to shatter any lingering hope. The situation felt utterly, irreversibly lost. The forest was gone. The foreman, Sykes, reached into his truck and pulled out a heavy cannabis bag. He didn't hand it to Gary. He let it drop with a thud on the hood of the truck. He unzipped it, revealing stacks of cash bound in rubber bands. As agreed, $400K. A few of the other loggers stopped their work to watch, their faces impassive. I was the old fool, the obstacle they had successfully cleared along with the timber. The visual of that money, piled on the cold metal, was a monument to my defeat. Gary started stuffing the cash into his jacket, but my silence seemed to unnerve him. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I simply stood there, hands folded calmly in front of me. My gaze fixed not on him, but on a single towering pine left standing at the far property line. There was a strange stillness inside me, a cold, clear focus that felt entirely out of place amid the wreckage. He expected a storm, but I gave him nothing but a quiet, unnerving calm. He couldn't see the gears turning. He zipped his jacket, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "What, not even going to say goodbye to your precious woods?" he taunted, trying to get a reaction, any reaction. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch my lips. His triumphant expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The trap was already closing around him, and he was too arrogant to feel its jaws. But months earlier, it all began with the sound of a single chainsaw. It started on a Tuesday. I was in the rustic cabin our father built, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the morning mist burn off the pines. It's a quiet life, the one I've known for 40 years as a retired biologist. Then I heard it, the growl of an engine, the high metallic scream of a saw. It was too close, far too close. My land, our land, was supposed to be a sanctuary. That sound was a violation, a trespass that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pulled on my boots and walked toward the noise. A quarter-mile in, the forest floor opened into a scene of carnage. My brother, Gary, was there, directing a crew of 3 men. They'd already felled half a dozen mature oaks. He saw me and waved, a cheerful, oblivious gesture. "Morning, Forrest. Decided to unlock some of this property's potential?" His voice was breezy, as if he were discussing pruning rose bushes, not clear-cutting a century of growth. The betrayal was so casual, so utterly blatant. "Potential? Gary, what is this?" I asked, my voice tight. He clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes already calculating board feet and dollar signs. "They're just trees, Forrest. They're worth more as lumber than as scenery. I got a buyer lined up. We're talking serious money." He couldn't see the intricate ecosystem, the home for dozens of species. He just saw dollar bills hanging from the branches, and he was eager to shake them loose. For him, this wasn't a crime. It was a harvest. My mind flashed back 40 years, to a cool summer night, with him and me, no older than 12, huddled in a tent right where we stood. We were listening to the owl, our father pointing out constellations through the canopy. He told us this land was our legacy, a living thing we had to protect together. The memory was so vivid, the smell of campfire and damp earth, that Gary's casual greed felt like he was setting a match to that memory, burning it all down for cash. I went back to the cabin, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. I needed the deed, any legal document. I pulled out the old cedar chest where Dad kept his important papers. Inside, beneath titles and tax records, was his old hand-drawn map of the property. It was sketched on yellow drafting paper, full of notes about soil composition and tree species. It was a biologist's love letter to his land, a beautiful, sentimental, and I feared, completely useless piece of paper. Gary came into the cabin later, tracking sawdust across the floor. He saw me with the map spread out on the table. "Still got that old thing?" he said with a dismissive chuckle. "Dad's doodles. I remember him spending hours on that. Worthless, of course, but I guess it's a nice memory." He tapped the paper with a grimy finger, his utter incomprehension a fresh sting. He saw a relic. I saw my father's soul, and he was trampling all over it, both literally and figuratively. The next morning, I learned the true scope of his plan. It wasn't just a few trees. It was a full-scale logging operation. A flatbed truck was already hauling away the first load. The foreman, Sykes, told me they had a contract to clear all 50 acres by the end of the week. A week, an entire ecosystem, a lifetime of memories, would be erased in 7 days. The ticking clock wasn't just a deadline. It was an executioner's countdown for the forest. I drove into town, hoping to confront Gary in a public place, thinking shame might be a weapon. I found him at the diner, holding court with some of the old-timers. When I tried to talk to him, he waved me off loudly. "Forrest is getting sentimental in his old age," he announced to the room, "crying over a bunch of firewood. He's forgotten what a dollar looks like." A few men laughed. The humiliation was hot and sharp. He had painted me as a dotty old fool. Afterward, old man Hemlock, who owns the adjacent property, pulled me aside. "Saw your brother meeting with that Sykes fella a few nights ago," he whispered, his eyes troubled. "Looked fishy. They were arguing about payment, and Gary insisted on cash. No paper trail." The detail snagged in my mind. Why would Gary, who loved boasting about his financial windfalls, want this one to be untraceable? They didn't know the whole story, and I was beginning to realize that I didn't either. I called the only lawyer in town, a man named Davies. I read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice laced with a weary sympathy that I instantly distrusted. "That's a lovely sentiment, but unless it's explicitly written into the deed as a restrictive covenant, the word stewardship has no legal weight. It's an emotional term, not a legal one." The flame of hope flickered and died, leaving me in the dark once more. My desperation was growing. Davies agreed to review the deed for a $500 fee. 2 days later, he called back with the final crushing news. "It's a standard joint tenancy with rights of survivorship," he said flatly. "You both own 100% of the property. He has as much right to harvest the timber as you have to watch the birds. I'm sorry, Forrest, but you have no legal standing to stop him." $500 to be told I was helpless. The defeat was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. That evening, I tried one last time to appeal to his humanity. I found him by his truck, watching the logger stack another load. "Gary, do you remember what you promised Dad before he died?" I asked, my voice raw. "We stood right here, and we told him we'd always protect this place, together." He just shook his head, refusing to meet my eyes. "Promises don't pay the bills, Forrest. I've got debts. This is my way out." His justification was as hollow as the fallen logs. The next morning, the sound of the chainsaws was the only thing I could hear. It was a constant, grinding symphony of destruction. I walked the perimeter, the boundary line of my shrinking world. They were moving with brutal efficiency. I paced it out. They had cleared nearly 15 acres already. Friday was the deadline. The week was half over. The forest was dying faster than I could have imagined. And I was forced to stand by and watch it bleed out. In the cedar chest, looking for something, anything, I found a photo of my late wife, Helen. It was taken 20 years ago, on our anniversary. She was leaning against the trunk of the old sentinel oak, the largest tree on the property, her face bright with joy. I looked out the window. Sykes's crew was working their way toward it. They'd be at the Oak by noon tomorrow. Helen had loved this place with a fierce passion. The thought of them taking that tree felt like a desecration of her memory. Driven by a desperate impulse, I went out to Gary's pickup, which he'd left unlocked. On the passenger seat, plain as day, was a copy of the logging contract. I scanned it quickly. It was a lump sum deal with a shell company I'd never heard of for exactly $400,000. Payment was listed as cash upon completion. The document was flimsy, almost amateurish. It confirmed my neighbor's story. This wasn't just a sale. It was a transaction designed to be invisible, to leave no tracks. My next move was to confront the foreman directly. I found Sykes refueling a chainsaw. "You have to stop," I said, standing my ground. "This contract is questionable." He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked me up and down, the sneer on his face. "Your brother signed it. That's all I need. You're on our work site, old man. Get in our way again, and I'll have the sheriff remove you for trespassing." The threat was no longer veiled. I was an intruder on my own land. Later that afternoon, hiding in the brush near the landing zone where they loaded the trucks, I overheard Gary arguing with Sykes. "I told you, no checks, no transfers," Gary hissed, his voice a low, angry rasp. "Clean, untraceable, that was the deal. Don't try to change it now." Sykes grumbled something I couldn't hear. The insistence on untraceable cash wasn't just about hiding income anymore. It was about severing all legal connection to this act. He was treating it like a crime he wanted to get away with. I retreated to the cabin as dusk fell. The thunder of a falling giant, probably the first of the big pines near the ridge, shook the floorboards. I was lethally cornered, physically threatened, and emotionally shattered. My brother, my only family, had sold our shared soul for a bag of cash. I sank into my father's old armchair, the relentless noise of the machinery outside grinding away at my sanity. I felt a profound sense of failure, to the forest, to my father, and to Helen. In the gloom of the cabin, I sat with my head in my hands. The legal avenues were closed, and my brother was a stranger, deaf to our history. I felt a crushing weight of impotence. My eyes fell on the cedar chest, and on an impulse born of grief, I pulled out my father's hand-drawn map again. I spread it on the table under the lamplight, its faded lines a cartography of my failure. It was all that was left of his vision, a beautiful, worthless ghost. My finger traced the property line near the Sentinel Oak, and there, in my father's precise, tiny script, was a notation I'd seen 100 times, but never truly registered. FSP 1138. I'd always assumed it was a survey marker number, a technical detail of no importance, but tonight, in the quiet desperation, it seemed to stand out, a tiny, nagging question mark on a page full of painful answers. What did FSP mean? It was probably nothing, just another dead end. By morning, they would reach the oak, Helen's tree. The finality of that thought was a physical blow. The deadline wasn't just the end of the week. It was noon tomorrow. I was about to fold the map, to surrender to the despair, when I heard my father's voice in my memory, as clear as if he were in the room. The details matter. Forrest, always check the details. Nature and the law are both in the details. It was what he'd told me when I was struggling with my biology dissertation. That memory was a spark in the darkness. I grabbed the old magnifying glass from his desk. Under the lens, the script was perfectly clear. FSP 1138. It wasn't a surveyor's mark. The syntax was wrong. It looked more like a program code, an official designation. My heart began a slow, heavy beat. For the first time, I felt I wasn't just looking at a map of the past, but a potential key to the future. I turned on my old desktop computer. The dial-up modem screeching to life. Hours bled into one another as I navigated the archaic websites of the county assessor in the State Department of Forestry. The sounds of trucks hauling away the last loads of the day were a constant, tormenting reminder of the time I was losing. I searched for land parcels, tax codes, anything. Then, buried deep in a public database, I found a match. FSP, Forest Stewardship Program. My breath caught in my throat. It was real. It was an official state program. The next click changed everything. The Forest Stewardship Program was a tax incentive plan for private landowners. In exchange for a massive reduction in property taxes, the owner legally designates the land for conservation and sustainable management. I scrolled down to the list of prohibited activities. The words leaped off the screen. Commercial-scale timber harvesting without a state-approved multi-year plan is strictly forbidden. This wasn't just a guideline. It was a legally binding covenant tied directly to the deed. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Gary's insistence on cash, the shell company. He wasn't just avoiding income tax. He was trying to hide an illegal operation. The program's penalties were severe. A full clawback of all tax benefits received for the past 10 years, plus interest, and a fine of up to 3 times the commercial value of the illegally harvested timber. My father hadn't just been the sentimental biologist. He'd been a shrewd planner, protecting the land with a legal fortress. Gary had been too greedy to see. I pulled up the county tax records. There it was, parcel ID 734, designated FSP 1138. Our property taxes for the last decade had been less than a tenth of their assessed value. A benefit Gary, who handled the estate's finances after Dad died, had clearly enjoyed without ever questioning its source. He was reaping the rewards of a program whose rules he was now flagrantly violating. The trap hadn't been set by me. It had been set by our father 10 years ago. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical calm. I wasn't the helpless old man anymore. I was the executor of a plan laid decades ago. I spent the rest of the night gathering the evidence. Screenshots of the FSP regulations, copies of our tax records, a photo of the logging contract I'd found in Gary's truck. The map, my father's map, sat on the desk not as a relic, but as my primary piece of evidence. It was the Rosetta Stone that decoded my brother's crime. At 6 a.m., I bypassed the local lawyer and called a prominent environmental law firm in the state capital. I got a junior associate, but I insisted on speaking to a senior partner. I must have sounded convincing, because by 6:30, I was on the phone with a Miss Chen. I laid out the case in 5 minutes, emailing her my neatly compiled evidence file. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Evans," she finally said, her voice sharp with professional excitement, "your brother has made a catastrophic error." Miss Chen confirmed the financial exposure was even worse than I thought. With penalties and interest, the total liability would be closer to $1.5 million. The state does not take kindly to this, she explained. They will move to place an immediate lien on the property to cover the debt. Since your brother is the sole actor and recipient of the funds, he will be held solely liable. The $400,000 cash in his pocket was nothing more than bait in a trap with million-dollar jaws. We will file for an emergency injunction to halt the logging immediately. Miss Chen continued, her voice all business. And you will formally notify the Department of Forestry's Enforcement Division. They will likely send an investigator today. Do not confront your brother. Let him walk into the situation completely unaware. The strategy was clear. Allow him to complete his crime, to take possession of the tainted money, sealing his fate before the authorities descended. As the sun rose, I heard the logging crew arrive. They were starting early, eager to finish the job and get paid. They were heading for the Sentinel Oak. I felt a pang of fear, but Miss Chen's instructions were clear. I had to let the process play out. I watched from the window as they began setting up their equipment near the great tree, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. The ticking clock was now measuring the final moments of the oak's life. Just before 9 a.m., Gary swaggered into the cabin. He looked energized, triumphant. He tossed a thick envelope stuffed with $100 bills onto the table in front of me. "Here's 10 grand, he said with a smirk. "A little something for your trouble. Can't say I'm not a generous brother." This was his final insult, a petty payoff meant to underscore his victory and my complete and utter defeat. He saw it as charity. I saw it as him trying to make me an accomplice. I looked at Gary, then up at his smiling, oblivious face. I slowly pushed the envelope back across the table toward him. "I don't want your money, Gary," I said, my voice perfectly level. His smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "What? Your pride is worth more than $10,000? Fine, suit yourself. More for me. He snatched the envelope and stuffed it into his jacket, misreading my calm refusal as the pathetic last stand of a broken man. Don't say I never tried, he said, turning to leave. They're taking down the big one now. Sykes wants his final payment, and then we're out of here. I'll be in Mexico by tomorrow. He was gloating, handing me his entire escape plan, completely unaware that every word was a nail in his own coffin. He walked out the door, whistling, striding confidently toward his own ruin. He was so busy watching the trees fall that he never thought to look up. I walked outside, my heart pounding, and headed toward the clearing. The air was vibrating with the roar of chainsaws. I could see the crew, with Gary watching as they made the final notch in the base of the sentinel oak. The massive tree shuddered, a deep groaning sound echoing through the ravaged forest. It began its slow, majestic, and terrible fall. For a moment, I felt a profound sorrow, an almost unbearable loss. It was the price of victory. The oak hit the ground with a cataclysmic crash that shook the earth. Gary let out a whoop of triumph. At that exact moment, two vehicles came speeding up the muddy logging road, a sheriff's cruiser and a dark green truck with the State Department of Forestry seal on its door. They parked, blocking the exit. A uniformed sheriff and a stern-faced agent in a khaki vest got out. They didn't hurry. They walked with the slow, deliberate pace of men who knew they had already won. Gary's smile vanished. He looked from the officers to me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Sykes shut down his chainsaw, the sudden silence deafening. The forestry agent, a man named Miller, walked right past Gary and began examining the stump of the fallen oak. "This is a designated forest stewardship property," Miller announced to the silent crew, his voice carrying in the still air. "This is an illegal logging operation." Every logger froze, their faces turning pale. Sykes immediately started shouting, pointing at Gary. "He told us he had the permits. We have a contract." The sheriff held up a hand. "We'll get to that. Right now, this site is closed. All equipment is to be impounded pending investigation." Gary was stammering, trying to protest, but the agent ignored him, instead turning to me. "Are you Forrest Evans?" he asked. I nodded. "We received a complaint from your legal counsel. Thank you for reporting this." Gary's head snapped toward me, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The sight of the cash-filled bag on the hood of Sykes's truck drew the agent's attention. "Is that the payment for the timber?" Miller asked. Sykes nodded dumbly. The agent looked at Gary. "Taking a cash payment for an illegal operation across state lines once you sell that timber, that brings a whole new level of trouble with it, son." The color drained from Gary's face. He had thought the cash would protect him, but instead it had made him the unambiguous target of a multi-agency investigation. My brother finally found his voice, a strangled, furious whisper directed at me. You did this." He started toward me, his hands clenched into fists. But the sheriff stepped between us, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "I wouldn't," the sheriff said, his voice calm but absolute. The moment of physical threat was over before it began. Gary was trapped, not just by the law, but by his own blind arrogance. He was cornered, with nowhere left to run. I spent that night in the quiet cabin. The silence from the forest was absolute, a peaceful blanket where a screaming wound had been. In the morning, I took my father's map and walked to the edge of the devastation. I looked at the fallen sentinel oak, its massive branches reaching out like arms in supplication. It was a tragic sight, but it was also a monument to the cost of greed and to a father's quiet, enduring wisdom that reached out from beyond the grave to protect his legacy. A week later, I was back at that same spot, but this time I wasn't alone. Miss Chen stood beside me, holding a file. Gary was there too, flanked by his court-appointed lawyer. He looked smaller, diminished, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of utter ruin. He had come to hear the terms of the deal, his one and only chance to avoid a prison sentence and a lifetime of debt. The stage was set for the final act of his self-inflicted tragedy. Miss Chen opened her folder. "The state's preliminary assessment of fines, back taxes, and penalties against your brother totals just over $1.8 million, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Gary's lawyer winced. His assets are frozen and the cash has been seized. He has nothing. Gary just stared at the stumps, his face ashen. He had turned a priceless forest into a worthless wasteland, and in the process had obliterated his own future for a few bags of cash he never even got to spend. However, Miss Chen continued, the state is prepared to offer a settlement. They will waive the punitive fines if the back taxes and the timber value are repaid. That amount is approximately $850,000. Gary let out a bitter choked laugh. I told you, I have nothing. It's impossible. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. The air was crisp, carrying the lingering, mournful scent of pine from the massacre. It was the same scent from the day it all started, but now it smelled of consequence. It is not impossible, Miss Chen said, her gaze shifting to me. My client, Forrest, as co-owner, is technically liable for a portion of this debt. However, given his cooperation and his demonstrable efforts to stop the illegal activity, the state is willing to consolidate the entire liability. She paused, letting the weight of the wound settle. Provided, of course, that certain conditions are met. Gary finally looked at me, a desperate, pleading light in his eyes for the first time. She slid a single document from her folder. This is a quitclaim deed, she explained. Gary will sign over his entire interest in the 50-acre property to Forrest, effective immediately. In exchange, Forrest will assume the full financial liability. He will take out a lien against the property to pay the state's debt. It was a clean, brutal solution. Gary would lose everything, the land, the money, his inheritance. He would walk away with nothing but the clothes on his back. A free man stripped bare. His lawyer read the document and nodded slowly. It's the only way, he murmured to Gary. You sign this, or you face charges that will put you away for years. You lose the land either way. Gary's face crumpled. The choice was between total financial ruin and total financial ruin combined with a prison sentence. He had flown so high on his greed, and now he was seeing just how far he had to fall. He was looking at the wreckage of his life, a clear-cut landscape of his own making. He looked at me, his voice a hoarse whisper. Why? You could have just let them take me. Why do this? I thought of our father, of camping under the stars, of a promise made between two boys. Because Dad wouldn't have wanted to see one of his sons in a cage, I said quietly. But he wouldn't have let you kill this Forrest either. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, of the land and of our father's legacy. This was the only way to save it. Miss Chen produced a pen. There is one final instrument, she said, pulling out a second document. A lien release. Once the debt to the state is satisfied years from now, this document, pre-signed by you, Forrest, will clear the property's title. But until then, the land is collateral. She was ensuring there were no loopholes, no way for Gary to ever come back and claim a stake. The legal walls were being erected, brick by meticulous brick, around what was now my sole responsibility. Gary took the pen. His hand trembled as he signed the quitclaim deed, his signature a frantic, angry scrawl. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and pathetic self-pity. He had gambled his birthright against a bag of cash, and he had lost in the most spectacular way possible. He had underestimated the quiet old man. He had underestimated our father's foresight, and now he was paying the price. He pushed the signed paper across the hood of Ms. Chen's car. Are we done? He snarled. His lawyer nodded. Gary turned without another word and walked away, not even looking back at the forest he had destroyed, or the brother he had betrayed. He walked down the muddy track, a solitary figure, shrinking against the backdrop of ruin, his pockets empty, his future a blank page. The crisp autumn air felt colder, cleaner, as he disappeared from sight. Miss Chen neatly filed the signed documents. The lien will be recorded tomorrow, she said. The land is yours, Forrest, and so is the get. The number, $850,000, was staggering. It would take me the rest of my life to pay it off through careful, sustainable forestry management, the very thing my father had intended. But it didn't matter. The land was safe. The bleeding had stopped. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like a heavy, sacred duty. In the following weeks, I began the slow work of healing. I consulted with the State Forestry Department, using my father's map as the blueprint. The notations about soil and species were no longer sentimental doodles. They were the first chapter of a recovery plan. The map, which Gary had dismissed as worthless, was now the single most valuable tool I possessed, guiding my hand in every decision I made about the forest's future. A logging company's equipment was sold at auction to help pay some of the initial fines. Sykes and his company faced their own legal troubles for not doing their due diligence on the permits. The ripples of Gary's greed spread wide, pulling others down with him. I took no pleasure in it. I was too busy focusing on my own overwhelming task, bringing a dead and broken thing back to life, one seedling at a time. One afternoon, my neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, came by. He'd heard what happened. He didn't say much, just stood with me at the edge of the clearing. "Your father was a smart man," he said, nodding toward the forest. "He knew his land, knew his sons too, I reckon." His words struck a chord. Maybe Dad had known, on some level, that Gary's character was a liability. Maybe the FSP designation was his final silent act of paternal protection, a failsafe against his own son's worst instincts. Months turned into a year. I spent every day in the woods, clearing slash, preparing the soil, planting saplings. Oak, maple, hickory. The work was backbreaking for a 73-year-old man, but it was honest work. It felt like an apology to the land, a penance for my brother's sin. The sharp scent of pine was gradually replaced by the smell of rich soil and new growth, a fragrance of hope instead of violation. The recurring motif of the forest scent was changing, evolving with the landscape. I received a postcard once, with a postmark from somewhere in South America. There was no return address. The message was just 2 words, scrawled in Gary's familiar hand. "You won." It wasn't an apology. It was an accusation, an admission of defeat from a man who still believed it was all a game. I placed the postcard in the wood stove and watched it turn to ash. He still didn't understand. It was never about winning or losing. It was about stewardship. On the anniversary of the clear cut, I took Helen's picture and nailed it carefully to a post near the stump of the sentinel oak. Around it, hundreds of tiny oak saplings were beginning to take root. It would take a century for them to reach the glory of their predecessor, but it was a start. Her quiet presence was there again, not as a memory of loss, but as a silent guardian for the new generation, a compass pointing toward the future. Sometime when the light is just right in the late afternoon, I'll spread my father's map on the work table. I look at his notes, his careful lines. I see now that it wasn't just a map of a piece of land. It was a map of his values. It was a testament to the idea that some things are worth more than money, that a legacy is measured not in dollars, but in the health of the living world you leave behind. It's a lesson Gary never learned. The state forestry agent, Miller, stops by occasionally to check on my progress. He told me my reclamation project was being used as a model for the forest stewardship program. He said my father's detailed map and notes were an invaluable resource. The irony was profound. The very tool my brother had mocked as worthless doodles had become the instrument of his downfall, the forest's salvation, and now a guide for others. Its true value was finally being recognized. The debt is still a mountain, and I will likely be working this land until my last day. But my purpose is clear. My life's work as a biologist wasn't over when I retired. It had just been waiting for its most important project. I'm no longer just a resident of this forest. I am its caretaker, its guardian, bound to it by law and by love. The responsibility is immense, but it is a worthy burden to carry. This morning, I walked to new trails, the ground soft beneath my boots. A young deer, unafraid, watched me from a thicket of new growth. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the promise of life returning. I reached the edge of the property and looked out over the valley, the rows of young trees, a testament to a battle won. I pulled my father's mat from my pocket, folded it carefully, and placed it back in my jacket. Then I turned and walked back into the woods to continue my work.